Mount Pleasant Sorting Office, Clerkenwell, London EC1, 3 February 1958, 20 past 2 in the morning. Ernest Cobb, 54, 19 years on, the night, sort, at section Y. Had 11 letters fanned across his left hand before his right hand touched the frame. He did this without looking down. 19 years had taught him the shape of a district address before his eyes had finished the first line where the N prefix ran, where WC started and where it stopped, which slot took a Holloway Road letter and which took Highbury. The third envelope in his hand was thinner than the rest pale airmail paper, addressed not to a street but to a force's post office number. He sorted it into the outward bag without breaking his rhythm. He did not know whose son, husband, or brother it was going to. He knew only that within the hour, it would be on a platform 2 levels below him, waiting for a train that had no driver. Around him, the hall was doing what it did every night of the year. Several hundred other hands at several hundred other frames, each working a different postal district, each moving at a speed that made the whole operation look, from the gallery above, less like a workplace than a single vast machine built out of ordinary people. What had to happen, inside a building the length of 1.5 miles of sorting tables, for a single envelope like that one to become, in under an hour, one part of a much larger and entirely anonymous machine? And what did Ernest Cobb's hands know about that machine? That no address on any envelope could ever tell him. Mount Pleasant had not been built for one letter. It had been built for all of them. The letter sorting office that Ernest Cobb worked in through the 1950s had gone up between 1,920 and 1,934. On the site of the old Coldbath Fields prison in Clerkenwell, a building of reinforced concrete, large enough that a period Postmaster General's report described its sorting tables as stretching for 1.5 miles, its floor space running to 6 or 7 acres, and its staff numbering close to 4,000, processing something in the region of 12 million postal packets in an average week. Some 1,700 mail vans were recorded calling at the building on a single day. Beneath the sorting hall ran the thing that made a building of that size workable at all: the Post Office Railway, a driverless electric railway on a 2-foot gauge track, opened in 1927 and running at up to 30 miles an hour through tunnels dug some 20 meters under the streets of London. Mount Pleasant held the largest of its stations and the line's main engineering workshop. Mail bags that Ernest Cobb closed and labelled at his frame went down by lift to that platform, and from there travelled underground, untouched by London's traffic, its weather, or its congestion, to the other sorting offices and railway termini the letters needed to reach. What the frame and the railway together could not do was decide, in the fraction of a second it took to read an address, which of several thousand possible destinations a given envelope belonged to. That decision still required a trained person. The building could move mail at extraordinary volume. It could not read it. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Royal Mail, between 1,900 and 1,980. The vehicle, the round, the sorting office, and the letter that the system carried. Not nostalgia for red vans. The documented operational reality of a postal system and the specific human meaning of what it delivered before the telephone changed what it meant to wait for news. Whatever you have ever waited for in the post travelled, at some point, through hands like Ernest Cobb's sorted in the dark, at speed, by someone who never learned what it meant to you. And if you remember these letters, or wrote them, or waited for them, put it in the comments. If a letter of yours, or one written to you, ever passed through a big city sorting office like Mount Pleasant before it reached its destination, what do you remember about not knowing which hands had carried it there? A future video in this series follows one of those same envelopes out of London and onto a bicycle round in the Scottish Highlands, where the sorting office's work ends and the postie's begins. Back on the night shift, the skill Ernest Cobb had was not one that could be written down. Post office instructions could specify which pigeonhole took which district. They could not specify how a trained sorter came to recognize, from the angle of a single stroke of a fountain pen, that a hurried hand had written E1 rather than E11, a distinction that mattered enormously to the man standing at the frame, and meant nothing at all to the person who had posted the letter that morning without a second thought. New sorters at Mount Pleasant were trained for weeks before they were let loose on live mail at any speed, memorizing not just the district boundaries of London but the logic behind them, which streets fell inside, which postal area, which office served which side of a main road, where one district's territory bled into the next. A trained sorter, working a familiar frame, could clear mail at a rate that would look, to anyone watching from outside the hall, like conjuring, envelope after envelope, read, judged, and placed. In the time it takes to read this sentence, none of that training happened quickly, and none of it was ever treated as optional. Post office instruction covered the district map, the correct handling of registered and forces mail, and the specific slot-by-slot layout of the frame a new sorter would eventually be trusted to run alone. Only after that groundwork was in place was a trainee allowed anywhere near a live frame during the busiest hours of the night sort. What 19 years added to that trained baseline was something closer to instinct than skill. Ernest Cobb no longer thought about the district boundaries. He recognized handwriting styles the way a shopkeeper recognizes regular customers, not the individual hand, which he never saw twice, but the type. The careful copperplate of an older correspondent, the rushed capitals of someone writing standing up, the particular unsteadiness of a hand writing in a hurry to catch a last collection. What did that recognition give Ernest Cobb? That a new sorter, working the same frame with the same instructions in front of him, did not yet have. And what happened to that knowledge built over 19 years and belonging entirely to one man's hands on the night he finally put his cap on the hook for the last time? Mount Pleasant handled every category of London's correspondence in the same building, on the same night, without distinction. Personal letters, business accounts, government papers, press proofs, parcels, and forces mail addressed to servicemen stationed abroad. An on-active service envelope passed through Ernest Cobb's hands the same way a gas bill did, sorted by district or by outward route, weighed by feel, placed in under a second. This channel's earlier documentation of the wartime aircraft service and forces correspondence has already established what a letter like that one could and could not say once it reached its recipient, what postal censorship permitted, and what families learned to read in the space between the permitted lines. What that research did not need to cover, because it belongs to a different part of the system entirely, is what happened to that same letter in the hours before it ever reached a censor, a serviceman, or a family. The anonymous, high-speed, entirely mechanical process of a sorting office treating a letter from the front exactly as it treated every other letter arriving that night. This was not indifference, it was the opposite of what made the system trustworthy. A sorting office that slowed down or handled certain letters with special care would have been a sorting office that broke down under its own volume within a week. The forces letter reached its recipient reliably because Mount Pleasant did not know, and did not need to know, that it was any different from the thousands of other envelopes moving through the same frame that hour. Mount Pleasant did not know what it carried. What did that anonymity cost the system? And what did it buy the people waiting at the other end of every one of those envelopes? Not every letter Ernest Cobb sorted in the 1950s was outward bound. Mount Pleasant handled inward international mail as well, including, through this decade, a steadily growing volume of correspondence connected to the arrival of Caribbean migrants who had begun settling in Britain from 1948 onward. Letters addressed in a hand shaped by a Kingston or Bridgetown school, posted to relatives newly arrived in London boarding houses, passed through the same frames, sorted by the same district logic as everything else. This channel's existing documentation of Windrush generation correspondence has already traced what those letters carried in both directions: news from home, requests, reassurance, the specific loneliness of a first winter in a country that had not prepared itself for the people it had asked to come. What belongs here, in the story of Mount Pleasant specifically, is a narrower fact: that a letter carrying all of that weight was, to the sorting office itself, indistinguishable from a solicitor's circular. It arrived, it was read for its address only, and it moved on. For the person waiting in a London boarding house, an airmail envelope from Kingston or Bridgetown was never just correspondence. It was the one part of the week that connected a cold, unfamiliar city back to a home several thousand miles away. None of that weight traveled with the letter through Mount Pleasant. It arrived only at the far end, in the hands of whoever tore the envelope open. The postal system that made those transatlantic correspondences possible had no capacity to recognize what any individual exchange of letters meant. It could recognize only where an envelope needed to go next. That limitation was also, in a strange way, its integrity. A sorting office that treated an immigrant's letter with more caution, more delay, more scrutiny than any other envelope would not have been a neutral carrier of the post. Mount Pleasant's blindness to content was the same blindness that let every letter, regardless of who had sent it or who was waiting for it, move through the building at exactly the same speed. If the system's strength was that it treated every letter exactly alike, what did that leave for the people at either end of the correspondence to supply for themselves? And where, in a process built entirely around speed and anonymity, did the actual reading of a letter finally happen? The people who worked Mount Pleasant's night shift through the 20th century formed one of the largest single concentrations of working-class labor in London. Shifts ran around the clock, but it was the overnight sort, roughly midnight to 6, that carried the heaviest volume. As the evening's collections from pillar boxes and sub-offices across the capital converged on the building at once, the heaviest of all the night shift pressures fell in December. The Christmas card peak swelled the ordinary nightly volume by a wide margin, and Mount Pleasant took on temporary seasonal staff to help clear it, men and women who worked only the weeks around Christmas, learning enough of a single frame's district logic to help, while the permanent night shift sorters carried the parts of the work that could not be taught in a fortnight. That night world had its own internal culture, and it was not an entirely equal one. The Postal Museum's own archive records that in 1905, 93 female staff working in Mount Pleasant's returned letter office petitioned for separate cloakroom accommodation, apart from the men, a request the Postmaster General refused. The same group also asked for a pay rise to meet the rising cost of living in London, noting that outside employment had increased its rates, while the post office's own pay scale had not kept pace. Working at Mount Pleasant, in other words, meant working inside an institution that had to be pushed by its own staff toward the conditions it eventually provided. What that pushing produced over decades was a workplace with strong union organization and a genuine, if hard-won, camaraderie among people who shared some of the least sociable hours in London, a night world of humor, routine, and the particular closeness of colleagues who saw each other at 3 in the morning far more often than they saw their own families awake. What did it mean to belong to a workforce that large, working hours that unsociable, inside a system whose entire value to the public depended on nobody outside the building ever thinking about the people who ran it? And what happened to that workforce's sense of its own leverage, once it understood exactly how much of London's daily life depended on it? Ernest Cobb's Section Y frame stood empty for the first time in his working life on the 20th of January 1971. That morning, members of the Union of Post Office Workers walked out in Britain's first ever national postal strike, after the post office's pay offer of 8% fell well short of the union's claim. It was a dispute involving something in the region of 200,000 workers, and it lasted 44 days, very close to 7 weeks before strikers voted, 14-1, to return to work on 8 March without a settled pay agreement in place. For those 7 weeks, Mount Pleasant's 1.5 miles of sorting tables sat still. The post office temporarily lifted its own monopoly on letter delivery so that private operators could fill part of the gap, and a patchwork of licensed and unlicensed private posts sprang up to move at least some of the correspondence the official service could no longer carry. It was not enough. Business accounts went unpaid because the demand for payment never arrived. Pension books and benefit notifications sat undelivered. Personal letters, the ordinary daily traffic that Ernest Cobb had spent his working life sorting without a second thought, simply stopped moving. The strike revealed, by its absence, exactly how much of Britain's daily life had been built on the unspoken assumption that a building like Mount Pleasant would keep working. Nobody outside the postal service had needed to think about the sorting office before January 1971. For 7 weeks, they thought about very little else. What did it mean for the people who worked the frames? People who had spent decades being invisible to the public precisely because the system worked to discover, all at once, exactly how visible their absence could make them? Ernest Cobb worked Section Y until 1979, the year Mount Pleasant installed one of the earliest optical character recognition sorting machines used anywhere in the British postal system, a device built to read a printed or typed postcode and route the envelope automatically, without a trained pair of hands and eyes standing between the address and the frame. The machine did what it was built to do. It read postcodes faster than any sorter at any speed could hope to match, and it did so without needing 19 years to learn the difference between an E1 and an E11 written in a hurry. What it could not do was the thing Ernest Cobb had never been asked to do either, and had never thought of as part of his job. It could not know what any given envelope meant to the person who had written it, or the person waiting for it. That had never been the machine's job, or the frame's job, or Mount Pleasant's job. It had simply been the quiet, background fact that made the whole system trustworthy, that the letter would be treated exactly like every other letter, and would still, somehow, arrive. Mount Pleasant did not close. It changed what it needed from the people inside it. Fewer trained sorters were needed at the frames each year after 1979, and the specific, unteachable instinct that 19 years had built into Ernest Cobb's hands had nowhere left to be useful once postcodes could be read by a machine instead. The building's other great mechanism went the same way in its own time. Mount Pleasant's parcel operation was largely moved out to Brent Cross in 1984, with the last of it gone to Camden Town by 1996. The post office railway that had carried Ernest Cobb's sealed bags beneath London for over 3 decades ran for the final time on 31 May 2003. After 76 years of continuous underground operation closed because moving mail by road had become, by Royal Mail's own account, some 3 to 5 times cheaper than keeping the tunnels running. In 2017, a section of that same railway reopened not to carry mail, but to carry visitors, a 15-minute heritage ride beneath the very sorting hall where Ernest Cobb once worked, now telling the story of a system that no longer needs the tunnels to survive it. What the optical reader could do, it did better than any sorter Mount Pleasant ever trained. What it was never designed to do, recognize, in the weight of an envelope or the shake of a hurried hand, that the person who wrote it might have been afraid, or in love, or simply late for the last collection nobody had ever asked it to do. Because for the better part of a century, that recognition had quietly belonged to somebody standing at a wooden frame at 2 a.m, sorting a letter he would never see again. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Royal Mail carried and what it meant to the people who received it, subscribe. There are more sorting offices, more night shifts, more letters from active service, more emigrant envelopes that arrived at a door where someone had been waiting for the sound of the letterbox. Whatever you have ever waited for in the post, travelled, at some point, through hands like Ernest Cobb's sorted in the dark, at speed, by someone who never learned what it meant to you. And if you have a letter kept in a drawer or a shoebox, from a father in the war or a son abroad, put it in the comments. If a letter of yours, or one written to you, ever passed through a big city sorting office, like Mount Pleasant, before it reached its destination, what do you remember about not knowing which hands had carried it there? A future video in this series follows one of those same envelopes out of London and onto a bicycle round in the Scottish Highlands, where the sorting office's work ends and the postie's begins. Ernest Cobb retired from Section Y in 1979, the year the optical reader arrived at the frame beside his. Mount Pleasant's post office railway ran for the last time on 31 May 2003. In 2017, part of the same tunnel reopened to carry visitors instead of mail. What the machine gave the system, speed no human hand could match, and freedom from needing 19 years to train a single pair of eyes. What it was never asked to give, the quiet, unspoken recognition that a letter was not just an address to be read, but something somebody had once been afraid to send, or had waited 3 months to receive. Nobody had ever told Ernest Cobb to notice that. 19 years at the frame had taught him to notice it anyway. The machine did not need to. It never learned to.